On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable, and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous. And he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, Anne thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, big, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control. And her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl, whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, bound and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown. But it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, He blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had. So she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful blonde, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3. Not knowing what to do with them, he sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe, while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police had their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence. He knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night in Vienna" depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter, as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly 2 women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Swinney is too dangerous to ever be released again.
On the morning of June 4, 1989, at 9:30 a.m., members of the Tampa, Florida Coast Guard pulled the body of a woman from the water. Her hands were tied behind her back, duct tape covered her nose and mouth, and she was naked from the waist down. As they transported her to shore, another call came in. About 11 kilometers away, another body had surfaced. Like the first victim, this woman was bound and had likely been sexually assaulted. But the discovery didn't stop there. Shortly after the second body was found, a third appeared just a few hundred meters away. It quickly became clear that all 3 women had fallen victim to the same killer. They had been thrown overboard alive, one by one, and had been in the water for at least 3 days. 2 of the women were tied to a heavy cinder block with rope. Coast Guard officers had to cut the rope from around one victim's neck, suggesting the cinder block had likely been tied to her as well. The Coast Guard waited in horror, expecting more bodies to surface. Divers arrived to search the bay floor. Fortunately, no additional victims were found. The bad news was that the water had washed away all forensic evidence, and the bodies bore no identifying marks, no scars, no tattoos. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't even estimate the women's ages. There had been no reports of 3 women going missing at once. The police had no idea where to begin the investigation. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away from Florida, on a dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio, a vague sense of unease began to creep into the heart of 36-year-old Hal Rogers. His wife Joan and their 2 daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Krista, had gone on vacation and should have returned by now, or at least called to say they'd be late. This trip had been long awaited by Joan, Michelle, and Krist. Why? Have you ever worked on a farm? Imagine a life where it doesn't matter how tired you are, how cold or hot it is outside. There's work that has to be done, no exceptions. You wake up before dawn to milk 80 cows. By the time you're finished, the sun is just beginning to rise. You step out of the milking parlor and look across the fields, stretching endlessly to the horizon, all demanding constant care. By the afternoon, the cows need to be milked again. You might work straight through to late at night, and when you finally get home, there's still laundry, cooking, and other chores waiting for you. In the morning, you wake before dawn and do it all over again, day after day. Despite the grueling work, the family lived in harmony, finding little moments for simple joys. But their quiet, happy life came to an end when later that same year, a terrible truth surfaced. Hal's brother John, who lived in a trailer on the farm, had been secretly abusing Michelle for the past 3 years. Michelle had never told anyone because her uncle had threatened to kill her. But when John's girlfriend came forward with her own accusations of assault, the police searched his trailer. What they found wasn't just evidence of abuse against the girlfriend. There were also disturbing videos of Michelle. John was, of course, sent to prison, but the trauma he inflicted on the young girl was immeasurable. Michelle couldn't even bring herself to speak about what had happened. Her father was devastated. He couldn't believe someone had hurt his daughter right under his nose, and not just anyone, but his own brother. Worse yet, Hal's and John's mother sided with John, insisting her granddaughter was lying. In their tiny town, the rumors spread like wildfire. The family found themselves trapped in a living nightmare, unsure how they would ever recover. That's when the idea of a vacation came up. The girls were overjoyed. They had never been on a real trip before. For the first time in a long while, they were genuinely happy. They started planning an escape to Florida. Hal wasn't able to join his family on the trip. There was simply no way for him to leave the demanding work on the farm. His wife and daughters already helped him as much as they could, waking up before dawn to take care of chores before school or work. So Hal wanted to make sure they had the best vacation possible. On Friday, May 26th, Joe, Michelle, and Christy climbed into their 1986 blue Oldsmobile Calais and headed toward a tropical escape. They visited amusement parks, zoos, relaxed on the beach, and generally had a wonderful time. On June 1st, they left Orlando for Tampa, planning to visit one more amusement park before turning around and heading home. A businessman at the restaurant in the Days Inn at Rocky Point, where they were staying, saw them around 7 p.m. The woman and 2 teenage girls sat at the table in front of him. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he noted that they were in great spirits, laughing and joking. When they finished their meal and stood up to leave, Michelle glanced at him and politely said hello. Then all 3 of them disappeared into the night. They were never seen again. On June 7th, Hal woke up in a state of panic. After days of imagining a possible car accident or robbery, his mind began to paint darker, more terrifying pictures. His calls to the sheriff's office brought no answers. Someone had done something to his family, he thought. Fearing he might have to make an urgent trip, he withdrew $7,000 from the bank. But Hal would never get the chance to leave the farm. While he was thinking about heading to Florida, a housekeeper at the Tampa hotel had her own suspicions. She had been coming to room 251 every day for a week, but it looked like no one was actually staying there. She reported it to the hotel manager, who contacted the police. Homicide detectives quickly sealed and searched the room. Forensic specialists compared fingerprints found in the room to those of the unidentified victims recovered from the bay. They matched Joan and her daughters. All that remained was to notify the family. That same day, the sheriff showed up at Hal's door and told him about the murders. Hal couldn't believe they were all gone. He probably wanted to collapse, scream from the pain, or never get up again. But he couldn't. Someone still had to milk the cows. He kept working, tears silently streaming down his face. Meanwhile, police were searching for Joan's car, which was missing from the hotel parking lot. Since the victims had been found in the water, the nearest place where they could have accessed a boat was a local marina. Sure enough, the car was found there, and inside were two key clues. The first was a hotel brochure on which Joan had handwritten directions to the marina. Beneath them, she had written, "Blue and white." What could be blue and white at a marina? A boat, of course. Investigators discovered that around the same time the women checked into the hotel, a dark SUV with a blue and white boat had been seen in the parking lot. The problem? In Florida, there were countless SUVs towing boats that fit that description. But inside the car, police found one more clue, one that would prove crucial to the case. On another Tampa brochure, someone had written directions to the very hotel where Joan and her daughters had stayed. The handwriting didn't match any of the victims. Police hoped that this mysterious person who had given the tourist directions might know something. They circulated images of the handwriting and the victims' photos across local media, offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. The public responded immediately, but despite more than 800 calls, none of them brought police closer to solving the case. June 13th marked the day of the funeral. The church in Wilshire was filled with people, crying, holding hands, comforting each other. The only exception was Hal. He sat still, barely moving, his face blank and unreadable. After the service, he returned to the church alone and sat there in silence for a long time. Then he went back home to feed the cows. Someone had to. Spouses are usually the first suspects in murder investigations, and Hal was no exception, especially because he hadn't shown any visible emotion at the funeral. Why was he keeping everything bottled up instead of leaning on friends for support? Could he have been in on it? Maybe even with his brother, the one accused of abusing Michelle? Did he have any financial motive for the deaths of his wife and daughters? Yes, he stood to receive some insurance money, but it was a small amount, not enough to raise suspicion. Investigators were also curious about the $7,000 in cash Hal had withdrawn after the women had been killed, but before they were officially identified. Could he have hired a hitman? Hal calmly explained that he withdrew the money to pay for a trip to Florida, but never used it after learning what had happened to his family. The detectives expressed sympathy, but then directly asked him where the money was now. Hal led them to his pickup truck. Inside was $6,000, and he pulled the remaining $1,000 out of his pocket. He even volunteered to take a polygraph test, and passed. After that, the police no longer considered him a suspect. The detectives returned to Florida empty-handed. Investigators now believed the girls had encountered their killer in Tampa. Their interest was piqued when they learned of an unsolved case involving a Canadian tourist, 24-year-old Judy Blair, that bore several striking similarities to theirs. First, the assault had occurred just 2 weeks earlier and only a few miles from the murder scene. Second, Judy had been invited for a boat ride in the bay by a friendly-looking stranger who then attacked her on a blue and white boat. Third, the assailant had been driving a dark SUV. Those coincidences were too significant to ignore. Judy worked with homicide detectives to create a composite sketch of her attacker. The sketch, along with a description of the boat, was released to the media. Once again, police received a flood of tips, over 400 calls, but unfortunately none of them led anywhere. A year had passed and all the police had was a sketch of the rapist, who may or may not have been the killer, and a partial palm print found on the brochure. Members of the department were working 14-hour days, missing family holidays, but they had made no real progress. It was decided that the media would be used to the fullest extent. Police held regular press conferences, shared a psychological profile of the killer created by an FBI profiler, and raised the reward to $25,000. Joanne Steffi from Tampa had no doubt that the killer was her neighbor. She had already reported her suspicions to the police and was considering calling again. She hadn't liked her neighbor from the first day they met, several years before the murders. He had moved to a different neighborhood 2 years ago, but thoughts of him still haunted Joanne. The press conference stirred familiar emotions in her. On her refrigerator hung the police sketch of the suspect. It depicted a man aged 35 to 40 with reddish-brown hair, a high forehead, and a mustache. He was 173 centimeters tall and weighed approximately 85 kilograms. In other words, he looked exactly like her neighbor, 44-year-old Oba Chandler. Her neighbor also drove a dark SUV and had a blue and white boat. Plus, he fit the FBI's psychological profile. He had a profitable job installing aluminum siding, was intelligent, and had good manners. But there was something about him that frightened her. She remembered seeing him walking his dog, and they briefly made eye contact before he left. His gaze gave her chills. After watching the latest press conference, Joanne recalled that another neighbor had hired the man to do some repairs on her house. Together, they found the contract and check signed by Chandler. The handwriting matched the one on the victim's brochure. The women called the police and were given permission to send the information by fax. Joanne's persistence soon paid off. The handwriting samples landed on the desk of the lead investigator. The similarity convinced him to dig deeper into the man's background, and what he discovered was unbelievable. Oba Chandler, who now lived on the east coast of Florida, had, at the time of the murders, lived just 3 kilometers from the boat dock where the victim's car was found. Back then, he drove a dark blue Jeep Cherokee and used it to transport his blue and white boat. The man had repeatedly run into legal problems, and most importantly, he looked almost identical to the sketch. 3 years had passed, but now the detectives had no doubt he was their prime suspect. Indeed, obtaining a warrant purely based on intuition was not enough. Investigators decided the quickest way to arrest the man was by charging him with the assault on the Canadian woman. Judy Blair and her friend identified Chandler from a photo, and the judge issued an arrest warrant for him. Now that Oba could no longer harm anyone, the detectives were able to focus on the case. He had already sold his boat, but the police tracked it down and bought it back. Judy once again positively identified her attacker. A search of Chandler's home revealed a green mesh football shirt, the same one he had worn during the assault on the woman. But the most incriminating evidence came from Chandler's own words. He unexpectedly visited one of his daughters, Crystal Mays, in Cincinnati shortly after the police released the suspect's sketch to the media. He told his daughter and her husband that he had assaulted 2 women on a boat and added that he had killed 3 women. These statements allowed the authorities to formally charge him with the murders of Joe, Michelle, and Christy. The trial began on September 19, 1994, 2 years after the arrest. The prosecution could not present physical evidence or eyewitnesses to the crime, so there was no certainty about a guilty verdict. The defense seized on this. The lawyer followed a very simple strategy. He did not particularly contest the assault on the Canadian woman. He did not even deny that Chandler had met the victims. He assured the jury that there was simply no evidence that Chandler had done anything other than give them directions. As for the defendant, he watched the proceedings with a bored indifference. He sent a smile to the jury as if to say that this farce would soon end. One of 2 witnesses testified that they had found Chandler's handwriting and fingerprints on a brochure. His daughter spoke about a visit from her father and his confession. But the most powerful impression on the jury was made by Judy Blair's testimony. Judy told a heartbreaking story about the attack on her. She began by explaining how she and her friend met Chandler in the parking lot of a store. The pleasant man offered to give them a ride. After learning that they were tourists, Chandler warned them that they were in an area known for its high crime rate and advised them not to trust anyone. After dropping the girls off, he suggested taking them on a boat ride the next day. They agreed. Judy boarded the boat with Chandler twice. On both occasions, her friend wasn't with her, and both times Chandler seemed unusually irritated by her being alone. However, he managed to control his displeasure, and they had a great time. Around noon, the girl got off the boat to have lunch alone on the shore and returned to enjoy the sunset over the Gulf of Mexico. That's when everything happened. As night fell, she asked to be taken back to the shore, explaining that she was expected. Suddenly, the friendly man's behavior changed. He pulled her closer and stated that they would have sex, insisting on being close to her. Judy panicked, ran away, and started screaming. But who could hear her? Chandler stopped her hope of jumping overboard and swimming to shore, claiming that the water was full of sharks. Then he started the engine, and the boat began moving further away from the shore. Chandler again repeated what he wanted from Judy and said that if she refused to do it willingly, he would tape her mouth shut. "Is it worth losing your life over this?" he asked. He raped her 3 times. When she got off the boat, as though mocking her, he told her to be more careful. Chandler's lawyer stuck to a simple strategy. He didn't deny the connection with Judy. But what did that have to do with the murders? There were no ropes on the boat. He didn't threaten Judy or say he would throw her overboard. But the problem for the defense was that Judy was so convincing that the jury believed her. And they believed that in exactly the same way, Oba Chandler lured Joe, Michelle, and Christy onto his boat. The lawyer decided to allow the defendant to testify. The man calmly walked up to the witness stand. Dressed in a suit, tie, and reading glasses, he looked nothing like the killer of 3 women. Oba confirmed that he had seen them at a gas station and had given them directions to their hotel. The entire conversation took no more than 2 minutes. The women had never been on his boat, he didn't kill them, and after that brief meeting, he never saw them again. He was simply a fisherman and spent a lot of time on the boat because he loved fishing. On the day of the murders, he was fishing when, after 9:30 p.m., his engine started malfunctioning. He called his wife to let her know that he would stay on the boat for the night. The next morning, he noticed a Coast Guard inflatable boat and asked for help. But the 3 men on the boat told him they were too busy searching for a body and would come back to help later. He was picked up by another boat. It was now the prosecutor's turn to ask questions. He didn't try to dispute the man's alibi. He simply waited for details, hoping the defendant would say something that would give him away. And Chandler did just that. Afterward, the prosecutor called witnesses to disprove his statements. First, a Coast Guard employee testified that on that morning, there was no inflatable boat in the bay. No one had refused help to any boat, and that morning they were not searching for a body. Additionally, the crew of the inflatable boat consisted of 2 people. A third crew member could only join them if they knew in advance that they would need extra physical strength. Oba made this mistake, probably because he had seen a photo in the newspaper of an inflatable boat with 3 crew members pulling one of the bodies from the water. Then an expert testified who had inspected Oba's boat. He stated that the boat could not have broken down the way the man described, or else the engine would have exploded when he tried to start it. This statement completely convinced the jury. It became clear to them that Oba was lying about both the boat and other things. After 80 minutes of deliberation, they found him guilty of the murders and, after another 30 minutes, recommended the death penalty. Hal was relieved that Chandler was convicted, but that didn't bring his family back. It was incredibly difficult for him to adjust to life without his wife and children. He didn't seek therapy, but he did attend one group therapy session for people who had suddenly lost children. They were so overwhelmed by Hal's story and the scale of his loss that he felt uncomfortable and never went back. As a form of therapy, the man turned to his friends. In 1998, he remarried. His wife admits that when she married Hal, she married for Christy, Michelle, and Joe as well. They couldn't escape the ghosts of the past, but she did everything she could to comfort her husband, and he was deeply grateful for that. Hal admits that he rarely thinks of Chandler, who doesn't deserve such an honor. He only thinks of his girls. He believed that his execution wasn't even worth traveling to Florida for. But when his niece Michelle and Christy's cousin decided to go, he couldn't let her go alone. Hal and other family members gathered in a Florida prison on November 15, 2011. On the other side of the partition, there was no longer a youthful, imposing, middle-aged man. He was replaced by a sickly-looking prisoner. He didn't want to say anything at the end of his journey and denied his involvement in the murders until his last breath, claiming that they were executing an innocent man. It seems that the universe heard this statement and decided to respond. 20-year-old Ivelisse Berrios Begaris disappeared after work on November 26, 1990. At 10 p.m., she left a sports store in Florida with her colleagues, but they parted ways and each walked to their own car. When the young woman didn't return home, her worried husband found her car near the store with 2 slashed tires. He contacted the police and her naked body was found the following morning. Ivelisse had been assaulted and then strangled. Forensics took a DNA sample, but the technology at the time wasn't as advanced as it is today, so no matches were found. The case remained unsolved for 24 years. During this time, Chandler had been arrested, convicted, and executed. In 2013, detectives from the Cold Case Division reopened Ivelisse's case and sent the DNA for retesting. This time, it matched Chandler's DNA. On that fateful evening, he had slashed her tires so that Ivelisse couldn't use her spare tire and drive away. Then he approached her and offered to give her a ride. Chandler seemed like a pleasant, indifferent person, and since the girl had few options, she agreed. Afterward, Oba tied her up, took what he wanted from her, and killed her. As it turns out, he was certainly not innocent. The eve of All Saints' Day, 2012, was approaching. Rebecca Jane Gay couldn't contain her excitement. Halloween had been her favorite holiday since childhood. But this year promised to be extra special. Her son, Conway, had just turned 3, old enough to start fully enjoying the festivities. And both of them deserved to make the most of it. Although Rebecca was only 24, her life hadn't been without its share of hardships. From an early age, Rebecca was known for her gentle nature and deep empathy toward others, traits that defined her throughout her life. She was very close to her family and was always there when someone needed help. Being around her was always easy and comforting. People also often noted her appearance. A beautiful blonde, she was frequently the center of attention, and she even helped other girls find their own unique style. After graduating from cosmetology school, Rebecca got a job as a stylist at a beauty salon in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. After work, she spent her time with her boyfriend, Chad. Not long after, Rebecca found out she was pregnant. When their son Conway was born, the young couple tried their best to maintain their relationship, but raising a child proved too great a challenge for them at that stage of life. Eventually, they separated but remained equally involved in their son's life. His happy childhood became their top priority. Needing support with parenting, Rebecca moved into the same trailer park where her mother, Sally, lived. Sally wasn't alone. She lived with her boyfriend, John White, a pastor at the local church. John was often introduced as Sally's fiancé, but in reality, they couldn't legally marry because Sally was still technically married. Her husband, the father of her 3 children, had fallen ill a few years earlier and had been placed in hospice care. Left lonely without her husband, Sally had met John on a dating site on Halloween in 2007. At first, they had a long-distance relationship. John lived 2 hours away, but he eventually moved into her trailer and began serving as pastor at the same church where Sally taught Sunday school. Now Rebecca and Conway lived nearby, and Sally and John were happy to help. Before long, they were spending most evenings together. John cooked dinner, and everyone doted on little Conway. Even with their support, it was difficult for Rebecca to spend enough time with her son, so she left the salon and took a cashier job at a store with a more flexible schedule. She worked morning shifts and spent her evenings with family, and not just them. A new man had entered her life, Aaron Quinn. Rebecca met Aaron when Conway was just a year old, and they had now been dating for 2 years. Aaron treated Conway like his own son. Rebecca's loved ones had never seen her this happy before. They knew Aaron considered her the one, and they also knew his little secret. Aaron had been saving up since Christmas to buy a ring. For weeks, he had been planning to propose, and he believed that Halloween, Rebecca's favorite holiday, would be the perfect time. Rebecca had no idea about his plan, but she too was dreaming of a wedding with Aaron. Life was finally falling into place for her. Motherhood had changed her for the better. She had always been kind and gentle, but becoming a mother gave her life purpose. She was balancing work and home beautifully, never complained, and although she lived modestly, she made sure Conway had everything he needed. Her dedication at work earned her a promotion, and she had recently shared with her family that she wanted to go back to college to fulfill her full potential. Then came October 30th. Rebecca was excited about her favorite holiday. Being a planner by nature, she had already prepared a Spider-Man costume for her son. Around 10 p.m., she spoke to Aaron and her mother on the phone, wished them good night, and promised to see them the next day. Sally and Aaron had no reason to doubt her words. What they didn't know was that Rebecca's favorite holiday would soon become a day remembered by her loved ones for very different reasons. On the morning of October 31st, Rebecca didn't show up for work, something completely out of character for her. After all, she hadn't earned her recent promotion by being late or unreliable. When no one was able to reach her, a coworker, an assistant manager, decided to drive over to the trailer park. He didn't know exactly which trailer she lived in, but it wasn't hard to find. Hers was the one most brightly decorated for Halloween. He was greeted by garden scarecrows, pumpkins, cobwebs on the windows, and even yellow police tape. Rebecca's coworker knocked on her door, but there was no answer. He tried the handle, but the door was locked. Her car wasn't parked nearby either. He got back into his vehicle and started to drive off, until he noticed something strange. Rebecca's car was parked near a nearby bar. That was odd enough for her co-workers to contact the owner of the trailer she rented and ask him to open the door. Inside, the trailer was empty. Rebecca had left, but for some reason, she hadn't taken her favorite handbag with her. It was a gift from Aaron, and she never left the house without it. Her co-workers got in touch with Sally and John, who quickly reported Rebecca's disappearance to the police. However, since she was 24 years old, officers were in no rush to get involved. They decided to wait until evening, when Rebecca was supposed to meet up with Chad to pick up their son, since Conway had spent the day with his father. But Rebecca's loved ones knew the police were wasting precious time, so they launched a search on their own. Pastor John reached out to his congregation, and many were eager to help. When evening came and Rebecca never showed up to meet Chad, the police finally began their investigation. They started by examining Rebecca's car and home. The car was messy, as you might expect from a busy mom of a 3-year-old, but one detail stood out. The driver's seat was pushed far back, much farther than a petite woman like Rebecca would need. Employees at the nearby bar confirmed that she hadn't come by the previous evening, though no one really thought she had. Rebecca would never have left her son home alone to drive to a bar she could have walked to. Besides, the bar closed at 8 p.m. on Tuesdays, long before her phone calls with Aaron and her mom. The bar staff also noted that Rebecca's car hadn't been there when they closed for the night. Altogether, the details painted a picture not of a missing person's random detour, but of someone trying, clumsily, to throw investigators off track. As for Rebecca's home, there were no signs of forced entry. Her cell phone and car keys were missing from her belongings. Then officers noticed a small patch of carpet between the living room and the hallway that looked oddly fluffed, as if someone had scrubbed it. On closer inspection, they spotted brownish stains resembling blood. There was also a crack on the wall from what looked like an impact, with similar stains nearby. Once they confirmed it was blood, police realized Rebecca's trailer had become a crime scene. The playful yellow Halloween caution tape she had hung was replaced with the real kind. Against the backdrop of festive decorations, it was a surreal sight. Any thought of celebration vanished instantly. Everyone was asking the same question. What had happened to Rebecca? Had a random stranger targeted the beautiful young woman? Was she being held somewhere against her will? Little Conway was inconsolable. He didn't get to go trick-or-treating in his Spider-Man costume, and for the first time in his life, he fell asleep without his mother's embrace. Investigators began the case by speaking with Aaron, the new man in Rebecca's life. At first glance, it was clear how distraught he was. He explained that the last time he spoke to Rebecca was around 10 p.m. the night before. At 10:43 p.m., he sent her a goodnight message. She didn't respond, likely already asleep. But then something odd happened. Wanting to brighten her morning before her early shift, he sent another message at 6:33 a.m. The message bubble turned green immediately, an indication that her phone was either turned off or had lost internet connection. That struck Aaron as unusual, since nothing like that had happened in the 2 years they'd been together. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it pointed to something ominous. It likely meant Rebecca had been taken before 6:33 a.m. Aaron himself had a solid alibi for both the night and the following morning. But Aaron wasn't the only important man in Rebecca's life. What if the father of her child, Chad, wasn't happy about her new boyfriend and didn't want another man around his son? That sort of thing happens all the time. However, Chad explained that he and Rebecca had maintained mutual respect after their breakup. They respected each other's boundaries, and he had no idea who could have taken her. In fact, he grew frustrated with the detective, feeling that time spent questioning him could be better used actively searching for Rebecca. The detective managed to calm Chad down, explaining that they needed to understand how Rebecca lived and who was involved in her day-to-day life. Chad shared that he usually spent time with their son on Wednesdays. Halloween had been no exception. That morning had gone just like any other. Since Rebecca worked the morning shift, it was John White, her mother's boyfriend, who had dropped off Conway. Sally and John often helped the young mother and would bring Conway in her place. It wasn't out of the ordinary. After the conversation, detectives were able to rule out Chad as a suspect as well. Naturally, the next person detectives brought in for questioning was Pastor John White. After all, it seemed he was the last person to have seen Rebecca, only he hadn't seen her. Here's what John told them. Around 6:30 a.m., he walked over to Rebecca's trailer. The porch light was on, which usually meant she was awake and expecting him. He saw a shadow in the bathroom window, suggesting she was inside. He knocked, found the door unlocked, and let himself in. He called out to her, and according to him, Rebecca responded, telling him to lie down on the couch and rest while Conway was still asleep. So he did. He covered himself with a blanket and dozed off. He seemed to recall Rebecca saying goodbye before leaving and asking him to turn the heat down. But the 55-year-old wasn't entirely sure if that had happened that morning or if he was confusing it with another day. After all, he and Sally helped Rebecca with Conway almost daily. Everything blurred together. And it was early. He wasn't fully awake yet. Around 8 a.m., Conway woke John up and the pastor drove the boy to his father's place. In other words, John never actually saw Rebecca. He only heard a voice. Was it really hers? Could someone have been in the bathroom with her, forcing her at gunpoint to speak? Investigators strongly suspected that second possibility, especially since they now knew her phone had already stopped receiving messages by that time. During the conversation with John, the detective noticed several scratches on his face and hands. When asked about them, John explained that he enjoyed working with his hands and had injured himself while fixing a shelf in his trailer. It had fallen on him mid-repair. In order to rule him out completely, officers asked John to take a polygraph test. John was hesitant at first, but Sally convinced him to take the polygraph test. After all, he had nothing to hide. In this way, the police could finally focus their efforts on finding Rebecca. Reluctantly, he agreed. The detective was supposed to take him to the testing location. On the way, they started talking, and John explained why he was initially reluctant to undergo the lie detector test. He shared that when he was much younger, he was not the man he had become. A long time ago, a girl he had been friends with died from illegal substances in his presence, and he served 2 years in prison as a result. However, he made it clear that he wasn't hiding anything. Sally knew, the members of his church knew. In fact, he was considered a success story, a man who had made mistakes but had changed and become a pastor. But was it really that simple? The investigators decided to dig into his past to review the details of his case while John would undergo the polygraph test. John had a perfectly normal childhood and adolescence. His father was the chief of police in the fire department in a small town, so he raised his children with a strict hand. John's sister, Christina, remembers that her brother always protected her and took the blame upon himself, even if she was the one causing trouble. She truly loved and even idolized him. After school, John served in the Navy and spent a significant amount of time in Japan. Upon returning home, he married one of Christina's school friends, Dawn. John was the life of the party, always telling stories about his time in the military or his travels. He was well suited to the role of a loving husband, and the couple dreamed of having children. However, what happened next came as a complete shock to John's family. In 1980, John decided to strike up a friendship with a 17-year-old girl. Well, not exactly a friendship. On March 19, 1980, Christina was watching TV when the news reported that 22-year-old John White had been arrested for stabbing 17-year-old neighbor Teresa Etherton. Christina immediately called her brother's wife, Dawn, who explained that John and Teresa had been using illegal substances in the basement of their house. Apparently, the girl had attacked him because she wanted to take the remaining cannabis. Dawn was upstairs when John ran up the stairs, shouting that he thought he had just killed the poor girl and that they needed to call the police. John was also injured, with cuts on his hands. Both were taken to the hospital. John repeated his story about how the girl had attacked him, injuring his hands as he tried to defend himself. He passed out from shock, and when he came to, Teresa was lying in a pool of blood next to him. The girl had to undergo surgery, but she survived. After regaining consciousness, she told an entirely different story. According to her, John had attacked her, but that didn't make sense. Why would he stab a young neighbor girl in his own home when his wife was upstairs? John's sister, Christina, couldn't believe it, but stubborn memories from childhood kept resurfacing, reminding her that her brother might have been capable of such heartlessness. He had always defended her. They were family, and Christina never believed her brother could show cruelty. No, but Christina noticed that her brother might be somewhat different. When they were children, many kids took up paper routes to earn some money. Christina wasn't an exception. One morning, a large dog ran out of a neighbor's house. The dog wasn't aggressive, but jumped on the little girl. It was much heavier than Christina, so it knocked her to the ground, frightened her, and the girl ran home in tears, telling her parents and brother about it. Her parents rushed to comfort her, but her brother just stood there calmly. The next day, while delivering newspapers, Christina didn't see the dog. She thought the neighbors had started training it, but at school she was told that her neighbors were heartbroken because the dog had been found behind their house, in the woods. Someone had shot it. Since there were many hunters in the area, Christina never suspected her brother until he confessed to her. What was even more terrifying was his description of how coldly and mercilessly he had done it. That was when Christina began to think that her brother's moral compass might be skewed, and he didn't understand what was right and what was wrong. Yet she stubbornly kept searching for excuses for his actions. In any case, in 1981, John stood trial for the attack on Teresa. He served 2 years in prison. After his release, he became a long-distance truck driver. Dawn waited for her husband's release, and she and John had 2 sons. After the birth of their second child, John quit his job as a truck driver because he wanted to be closer to home. He got a job as a service technician for industrial washing machines. For a while, it seemed like John had managed to stay out of trouble. But 14 years after the attack on Teresa, he found himself in trouble with the law again. In July 1994, in the same town where John lived with his family, Kalamazoo, Michigan, a 26-year-old woman named Vicki Sue Wall went missing. By a strange coincidence, she worked for the same company as John. Her car was found in a parking lot. Police reviewed the parking lot's surveillance footage and saw that Vicki had arrived and parked. Soon, another car, very similar to John's, pulled up. A man with a distinctive appearance, tall, muscular, with a thick beard, got out. It was John White. Vicki got into John's car and they drove off and didn't return. In the police station, John tried to deny everything, but when they showed him the footage, he changed his story. It turned out that the 37-year-old man had started an affair with a 26-year-old colleague. According to him, that night he picked up Vicki and they spent time together as usual. She was alive and feeling fine when they parted ways. The police had to release him as there was no evidence against him. However, before leaving, he casually mentioned that he sometimes experienced memory lapses. He would black out, and when he came to, he couldn't remember what he had done. In John's car, the police found blood, but the DNA analysis at the time was far from what it is now. The forensic experts needed a lot of fresh, non-dried blood to obtain results. In the car, they only found traces of blood that had clearly been cleaned. There was only a small amount of blood, and the police believed the victim might still be alive. While the search for the missing girl continued, John checked himself into a psychiatric hospital. Unfortunately, 6 weeks after Vicki Sue Wall's disappearance, the search ended with the discovery of her body in the woods. It had decomposed so badly that the cause of death couldn't be determined. Based on the condition of her clothing, it was concluded that her death was a sexual homicide. Since she was last seen with John, the police went to the psychiatric hospital and arrested him. He claimed that Vicki enjoyed rough intimacy, which included erotic asphyxiation. After he picked her up, they used drugs and made love when she suddenly slumped back in the car seat. He tried to lift her, but she didn't respond. Since John was also under the influence of drugs, he blacked out and didn't remember the details. However, he said that he must have disposed of her body somewhere. When asked why he didn't call for help or take her to the hospital, John said he panicked, especially because of his past. The police didn't believe that a young, healthy woman suddenly collapsed in John's car, but they couldn't determine how Vicki had died. The prosecution offered him a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to a prison term of 8 to 15 years. During his time in prison, his wife divorced him, and he attended therapy and became interested in studying the Bible. It was there that he gained the title of pastor. His dream of becoming a pastor came true, but it turned his life and the lives of others into a nightmare. He was released in 2007 and moved in with his sister Christina and her husband. He had no one else left, as his parents had passed away while he was serving his sentence. It was difficult for him to find work as a pastor due to his criminal record. As a result, he had a lot of free time, which he spent communicating on dating sites. In 2007, John met Sally. It was also Halloween evening, and according to Sally, John was very kind to her. He told her about his past, but of course it was a highly edited version of what actually happened. Soon, Sally mentioned that her church was looking for a pastor. This is how John got the job and moved in with his beloved woman. For 6 whole years, it seemed like everything in his life had fallen into place. He loved Sally, enjoyed being somewhat of a father figure to Rebecca, and was happy to help with Conway. That was until Rebecca went missing. Christina hoped everything would be fine, but when they couldn't find Rebecca quickly and the police got involved, she was suddenly gripped by déjà vu. The investigators studied John's case files, but they couldn't definitively determine what had happened with Teresa and Vicki. John kept repeating the same story, like a broken record. Fortunately, they managed to get in touch with Teresa and hear her account firsthand. Now, she was 49 years old and married. But in 1980, when she was just 17, 22-year-old John moved into her neighborhood with his wife. Teresa was an ordinary teenager, homebody and well-behaved. She was also very beautiful. She didn't interact much with John, just greeted him politely when they met. But on March 19, 1980, she was looking for a friend and asked a neighbor if he had seen her. She was about to move on when he offered to show her a toy racetrack he had built in his basement. The man was so excited about the racetrack, and Teresa, being well-mannered, agreed to follow him. But as she entered the basement, a cold, instinctive feeling crept into her chest, whispering that she should run before it was too late. But before she could react, John lunged and stabbed her from behind under her right shoulder blade. Teresa didn't understand what was happening until she turned around and saw the knife. Within seconds, he stabbed her in the stomach. She watched as he repeatedly stabbed her, his face showing an expression of what could only be described as uncontainable pleasure. He was smiling. She collapsed to the floor, and he continued to stab her over and over. She felt the blade each time it entered her body. She screamed, fighting him despite the terrible wounds. John told her it wasn't his first time, and that she was only making things harder by continuing to fight. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Teresa grew weaker and thought that perhaps if she pretended to be dead, he would stop. She lay quietly on the floor in a pool of blood. John stopped stabbing her, wiped the blood off her lips, and began kissing her. Then he took her hand and said, "Now you're going to leave. I'm sorry you have to go like this. Though, what the hell? You're just a woman." He took the knife again. Teresa realized he would slice her throat, but she was so weak that she tilted her head and hoped it would be over quickly. Instead, the knife scraped along her chin. Then John picked her up, cradling her like a child, and began rocking her, saying, "Sleep, sleep." At that moment, something inexplicable happened. John's wife, Donna, came down to the basement. Teresa begged her to help, but the couple just covered Teresa's face with a sheet. It was unclear what they intended to do next, but then the sound of a police siren was heard. It was not Donna who had called the police, but a neighbor who had heard Teresa's screams. Donna simply walked away. Teresa was taken to the hospital. Doctors later concluded that John had inflicted 14 stab wounds on her. John's father immediately hired a lawyer for his son. John was convicted and sentenced to 10 years for attempted murder. The judge also recommended psychiatric evaluation. Teresa was promised that he would never be able to hurt her or anyone else again, but that promise turned out to be false. At the time, crime victims weren't always informed of every development in a case, so Teresa was never told that John White had filed an appeal and won. The reason? During the original trial, John's father had paid for his defense attorney. That attorney had intended to argue that John was not criminally responsible due to insanity. However, John's father refused to pay the $1,000 required to bring in a psychiatrist who could examine his son and testify to his mental state. As a result, John was able to appeal the conviction on the grounds that his lawyer had not done everything possible to defend him. After the appeal, there were two options: retry the case or let the judge issue a new ruling. For some reason, the second option was chosen. The judge gave him a 2-year suspended sentence, which meant he was released immediately after the ruling. It's hard to put into words the horror and disappointment Teresa felt when sometime later, she ran into him in town. He was standing in line at the city office, right behind her, smiling that same chilling smile she could never erase from her memory. So 12 hours had passed since Rebecca failed to show up for work. The police still held on to hope that she was alive. Knowing John's past, they suspected him of kidnapping and hoped he would provide some answers. A polygraph test, though lacking any scientific reliability, indicated that he was lying. Detectives brought John into the interrogation room while his car and home were being searched. They told him that forensic investigators were still working in his trailer, so he'd have to wait outside until they were done. Meanwhile, officers found what appeared to be blood in John's vehicle, as well as a necklace that looked like it had been torn off during a struggle rather than simply removed. In the trailer John shared with Sally, they discovered a rubber mallet sealed in a plastic bag, zip ties, and large, heavy-duty garbage bags. Of course, none of that was incriminating on its own, but they also found lingerie from Victoria's Secret in the smallest available size, obviously not belonging to Sally. Detectives began to fear the worst, that Rebecca was dead. They showed John photos of the items they had found, but he feigned ignorance. The investigators knew that, in his own twisted way, John cared for Sally, so they decided to use that against him. They pleaded with him to tell them where Rebecca was, so her mother wouldn't have to suffer from the uncertainty. The conversation dragged on for hours, and eventually John realized he was trapped. He asked for a lawyer, and the detectives left him alone in the room. After being given some time alone to think, John demanded a deal. In exchange for his confession, he asked for three things: one phone call to Sally, a life sentence, although Michigan doesn't have the death penalty, and the right to serve his time in solitary confinement. The detectives agreed. John was allowed to call Sally. He told her that he loved her very much, but that she wouldn't be seeing or hearing from him for a long time. He said that there was nothing he could do to change what had happened, and then ended the call, likely to avoid the flood of questions Sally immediately began asking. John White began recounting the details of all his crimes to the detective, as if he wanted to get a weight off his chest. He started with the fact that when he was 11 years old, he developed a fetish. His imaginary friend told him about dead girls and having sex with them. This was the real reason for the murder of Vicky and the attack on Teresa. John White did not talk about his other victims, although there are suspicions that during his time as a truck driver, he may have attacked women of easy virtue about whom no one would report to the police. And that is precisely why he enjoyed that job so much. After all, he had told Teresa that he had done such things before. As for Vicky, on the night of her death, he could no longer hold himself back, and regular sexual activity was no longer enough to satisfy the growing desire within him. So when she got into his car, he quickly and forcefully struck her in the stomach. Vicky doubled over in pain, and he tightened the zip tie around her neck. He drove the lifeless body of the girl to the forest and did with it what he wanted. John continued his story. He periodically watches films in which women are strangled and then their bodies are used for pleasure. According to John, these films intrigue him, and alcohol stimulates him to act on these desires. By the way, it should be mentioned that the parishioners were aware of their pastor's addiction to alcohol, but they turned a blind eye to it. John tried to convince the investigators that he had drunk a lot before Halloween and that alcohol was to blame for what happened next. But that was absurd. It wasn't alcohol that left Rebecca's trailer door unlocked. It was John, because he already had a plan. He waited until Rebecca and Conway fell asleep, and at 2 in the morning, he went to their trailer. In his hands, he had a rubber mallet. Rebecca heard the door to her trailer open. She jumped up, left her son sleeping in her bed, and went down the hallway. When she reached the corner between the hallway and the living room, John began beating her on the head with the mallet. He doesn't even remember how many times he hit her, but he did say that the girl managed to twist around, look at him, and say, "I know you." She fell to the floor but was still alive. John told himself, "Oh, and I brought zip ties." He tightened a zip tie around her neck and sat on the couch waiting for her to stop breathing. Then he dragged Rebecca onto the kitchen floor, stripped her of her clothes, and told the detective that he stopped there. He claimed he didn't feel the thrill he had dreamed of. The detective didn't believe him. Then John wiped off the blood and turned off the girl's phone. He took the car keys and threw her phone in the trash bin, leaving the car in front of a bar. Finally, he put Rebecca's clothes and her body in a large garbage bag and carried it to the car. But the bag ripped, so officers found blood and a chain in the car. Then the killer threw the clothes in the woods and left Rebecca's body in a ditch, not bothering to hide it very well. Incredible as it may seem, after this, he went back to his victim's house, lay on the couch, and napped until 8 in the morning when Conway woke him up. Among all this horror, the only comforting thing is that, according to John, the boy didn't see or hear anything that night. And here's the question: what if Rebecca hadn't heard the door open? What would the killer have done, knowing that Conway and Rebecca were sleeping in the same bed? Would he have spared the boy, or would he have sacrificed Conway for his base desires? Rebecca's body was found exactly where the killer had indicated. There were distinctive marks from the zip tie on her neck. Contrary to John's claims, the autopsy showed that she had been assaulted while still alive or immediately after her death. After John White's confession, Aaron remembered that Rebecca always wore her hair straight, but when she got a perm, John began to show more interest in her, appearing at her workplace, behaving oddly, and constantly commenting on her appearance. This is one of the characteristics of serial killers. They stalk young women whom they find physically attractive. All other personality traits don't matter. John's relationship with Rebecca, being her mother's boyfriend and caring for her son, didn't protect her. John didn't want to do it, but he knew he would be caught. He weighed the risks and decided it was worth it. Perhaps he even thought it would be better if he was caught. John begged for Sally not to see his confession, but of course Sally had to learn that her wonderful 24-year-old daughter had died at the hands of her boyfriend, the pastor. John was examined by a psychiatrist who concluded that the man was of sound mind, at least enough to stand trial. The defendant agreed to a plea deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. During the sentencing, Sally said, John White gets more rights than our daughter, who was a law-abiding citizen. When he was previously released from prison, he was like a starving lion. John was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 56 to 85 years. But he had previously managed to shorten his sentence, and this case was no exception. On August 28, 2013, at 4:17 a.m., he was found dead in his cell. He didn't like prison, and he found a way to avoid earthly punishment. Little Conway was raised by his father and his father's family. The days when he played with his mother, chose costumes, and decorated the house for Halloween would remain just memories, which over time would fade from his mind. Teresa, the surviving victim of John White, said, "I genuinely feel for this little boy, for Rebecca's family. They trusted him. I know what they're going through. She too had trusted him and nearly died. And when he was released, no one warned her and no one cared about her." Rebecca's family also stated that Rebecca wouldn't have lost her life at his hands if the court had kept him in prison or sent him to a psychiatric hospital. He was constantly released, even after his own confessions to a psychiatrist about his secret thoughts. Even John White's own son was worried when his father was about to be released again. He said, "My father knew he was mentally ill, but he refused to accept it and tell people about it, to accept help." In this case, it can be confidently stated that the judicial system made a number of mistakes and failed Rebecca. The cruel irony is that on the Sunday before Rebecca's murder, Pastor John had given a sermon on how important it is to be careful with the seeds people plant inside themselves. But no one suspected that he was speaking about the very thing he had been thinking so much about at that time. And perhaps the parishioners now wonder whether each of his sermons had lifted a veil over the dark, grim thoughts that haunted the pastor himself. Living and studying in the capital of France, Paris, is a dream for many. But while some only dream, 19-year-old Swedish girl Susanna Zetterberg, known to everyone as Sanna, was not afraid to turn her dream into reality. Convincing her parents to let her improve her French at the Sorbonne, Paris-Sorbonne University, she moved into a small studio apartment in Montmartre, staying with the aunt of her close friend. Sanna not only studied but also earned money for her personal expenses. At first, she worked as a nanny, looking after children, and later found a part-time job at a cafe in Galerie Lafayette, one of the most famous shopping centers in France. On Friday evening, April 18, 2008, Sanna was out with her close friends who had traveled from Stockholm specifically to spend the weekend with her. The girls went to the La Scala nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. They had a great time and drank a little. Around 4:30 a.m., Sanna told her friends that she had to work on Saturday and needed to go home. However, her friends weren't ready to end the night just yet. Sanna reassured them that she would be fine getting home alone. "I'll already be asleep when you get back," she confidently stated, and that was that. The girls stayed at the club while Susanna headed home. Around 5 a.m., Susanna's friends decided it was time to leave as well. They took a taxi and returned to the studio apartment where she lived. The place was only a 10-minute drive from the club, so they arrived, certain that Sanna would already be asleep. Imagine their shock when they found the apartment empty. They immediately tried calling her mobile phone, but their calls went straight to voicemail. On Saturday, April 19, 2008, around noon, a woman was walking her dog in the Chantilly forest, 40 kilometers from Paris. Near a bench on the side of the trail, she noticed something that made her step closer. As she approached, she was horrified to realize it was a body. The woman quickly contacted the police. The police arrived at the crime scene at 12:40 p.m. They examined the victim, a young woman, no older than 20. She lay face down, her hands cuffed behind her back, and her legs bent at a 90-degree angle. The handcuffs were not standard police restraints, but appeared to be from an adult store. The body was partially burned, with severe damage to the shoulders, back, pelvis, and upper legs. However, the fire had spared parts of her clothing, allowing investigators to determine that she had been wearing jeans, a jacket, and a scarf or bandana around her neck. Her shoes were missing. A bullet wound was visible near her ear. When officers turned her over, they were surprised to see that her face had not been affected by the fire. It was covered in dirt and leaves, and a hematoma was visible on her forehead. Despite this, it was clear that she had been strikingly beautiful, with blue eyes and light hair that created a haunting contrast against the gruesome scene. It was an image the police would never forget. They couldn't stop imagining the suffering this poor girl had endured before being abandoned in the forest, left out in the open, without even an attempt to conceal her body. Because the killer, or killers, had made no effort to hide the body, leaving it so close to the road. Investigators initially speculated that the victim could have been a sex worker. In that world, such an overtly staged murder might serve as a message or a warning. Near the body, officers found 2.22 caliber shell casings lying on the ground, with a third casing directly beneath the victim. The murder weapon appeared to be missing, likely taken by the killer. The police also found no personal belongings near the victim. There was no purse, no ID, nothing that could help identify who this young woman was. The police quickly set up a road patrol on the road located about 10 meters from the bench where the body was found. This was a frequently used road that ran through the Chantilly forest, with many people driving the same route daily on their way to and from work. The police hoped that some of these regular commuters might have noticed something unusual. They questioned the owners of more than 500 vehicles, and their efforts paid off. At around 6:45 a.m. on Saturday, 2 women on their way to work saw a fire. One of them became alarmed, fearing it could turn into a forest fire. She pulled over and called the fire department. The firefighters asked if the fire was large. The woman replied that a mannequin was burning. They then asked if she had anything to put it out. Fortunately, the woman was a veterinarian and had a bottle of water in her car for animals. She poured the water on the mannequin, successfully extinguishing the flames. Satisfied with her good deed, she drove away, completely unaware that, thanks to her actions, the victim's body had not been completely burned. At 6:25 a.m. on the same day, another man was driving through the Chantilly forest on his way to work. He noticed a car and was quite surprised. For many years, he had been driving through the forest daily and had never seen a vehicle in that spot. In the middle of the woods, what was it doing there? It didn't seem like a breakdown. The witness remembered that it was a white minivan with tinted windows. The police attached great importance to this testimony since the witness had seen the minivan within the time frame when the crime had occurred. Detectives were almost certain that the man had seen the killer's vehicle. In addition to the motorist, several morning joggers also contacted the police. It turned out that they too had seen the body near the bench, but just like the veterinary student, for some reason they also mistook it for a mannequin. The very next day, on Sunday, April 20th, the forensic pathologist performed the autopsy. He determined that the victim had died several hours before being discovered at noon. His conclusion was that the cause of death was a powerful blow to the chest with something very sharp, such as an ice pick. The weapon pierced the lung, causing severe bleeding, which led to asphyxiation. The forensic expert also found 4 bullet wounds at the back of the victim's skull. However, the wounds on the head barely bled, indicating that all 4 bullets were fired when the victim was already in agony and either dying or dead. In other words, the killer wanted to make absolutely sure that she was dead. One significant detail was that there was no smoke in the victim's lungs, meaning she hadn't inhaled it. This suggested that the killer set her on fire after she had died, and he had focused his efforts on her intimate areas. As a result, the forensic expert was unable to determine whether the killer had sexually assaulted the victim. However, one thing was certain: the cruelty the killer displayed toward her, even after her death, was undeniable. Toxicological tests revealed that there was alcohol in the victim's system, but not enough to dull her senses, nor to numb the pain and suffering she had endured. On Monday, April 21st, just 2 days after the body was discovered in the Chantilly forest, the Swedish consul contacted the police. He had heard about the body in the news and immediately connected it to the disappearance of a Swedish citizen who had gone missing on the night between Friday and Saturday. He sent the police the most recent photograph of the girl, taken on the very evening she disappeared. The photo was taken in a car, showing beautiful, smiling girls. The detective working on the murder case immediately recognized the red thin scarf found on the victim. He saw her stunning blue eyes, her angelic face, and realized that they had identified the poor girl who had been so brutally treated in the forest. Her name was Susanna Zetterberg. She was 19 years old. She was a student and lived in a small studio apartment in Montmartre, which belonged to her friend's aunt. When Susanna didn't return on Saturday morning, the woman who owned the apartment immediately became worried. She knew Susanna very well and knew that she was a responsible girl who wouldn't skip work, even though she had been out at the club the night before. Since she couldn't get in touch with Susanna by phone, the woman quickly went to the police. But as often happens, the police didn't take the girl's disappearance seriously. The woman insisted that it was completely out of character for Susanna to disappear like this. Moreover, it was unheard of for a 19-year-old girl to have her phone turned off for such a long period. However, feeling that the police were not taking the search seriously, the woman contacted the Swedish consul in Paris. He, in turn, contacted the police captain directly. It was now clear that the victim was Susanna Zetterberg. Since she had gone missing from Paris, the Paris police took over the case. They were also tasked with the difficult job of informing Susanna's family of her death. Upon hearing about her daughter's death, Susanna's mother became severely distressed. She never expected that something like this could happen to her daughter, that she could be abducted in the very heart of Paris. Standing by the woman's bedside, the police officers gently described what had happened to Susanna and promised to find the perpetrator. The investigators began examining Susanna's bank cards and quickly discovered that someone had attempted to withdraw money from her accounts in the immediate vicinity of where her body was found. This was clearly not Susanna, but a man. He had done everything possible to hide his face from the cameras. He wore a cap, glasses, pulled the collar of his sweater over his face, and used a latex glove to enter the PIN code. He withdrew money from several ATMs. At 6:02 a.m., he withdrew 100 euros, and at 6:59 a.m., he withdrew another 200 euros. This undoubtedly pointed to the fact that he was at least involved in her abduction and murder. At the same time, the police examined Susanna's phone and realized that the student's troubles began as soon as she left the nightclub. She had told her friends that she would take a taxi home. Indeed, at 4:30 a.m., Susanna got into a car. The trip from the La Scala nightclub near the Louvre to her studio apartment in Montmartre should have taken no more than 10 minutes. However, according to her phone records, 20 minutes later, she was moving in the opposite direction from her home. The phone connected to the cell tower several more times at 4:51, 4:56, 5:02, and 5:13, each time further away from the city center. After that, the phone stopped working and the girl disappeared. Clearly, there was a connection between the route she was taking and the taxi driver she had gotten into. This assumption was confirmed by Susanna's friends. When she was on her way home, they called her to say that they were getting into a car and would be arriving shortly after her. In response, Susanna said in Swedish that she was in a strange taxi. She didn't explain what was strange about it, but judging by her voice, she didn't seem particularly worried, so her friends didn't think much of it until it was too late. Investigators conducted a large-scale survey among the city's taxi drivers, asking who had worked in the area near Rue de Rivoli on the night from Friday to Saturday. One of the drivers reported that around 4:30 a.m., when Susanna was likely preparing to return home, he too was waiting for a passenger near the La Scala nightclub. A young woman approached him and asked if he was available. She spoke with an accent, and the driver thought she might have had a bit to drink. He replied that he was waiting for a passenger. Then, the driver noticed a white minivan pull up and park nearby. This detail immediately caught the investigators' attention because it was the same kind of vehicle a witness had seen in the Chantilly forest. The taxi driver went on to say that, after a while, the minivan drove off, and he no longer saw the girl. This led to the assumption that Susanna, if it was indeed her, may have gotten into the white minivan. However, the most interesting detail the witness added was that it wasn't a legitimate taxi. The driver was working illegally. Illegal taxis don't have official markings, and they typically look for passengers near clubs and concert halls in the evening. At that time, there were around 150 such illegal taxis operating in the capital. As the case attracted a great deal of attention, it allowed the police to receive a wealth of additional crucial testimonies. In particular, a young woman came to the station and shared her story. She worked at a restaurant near Rue de Rivoli, close to the La Scala nightclub. A week before Susanna's disappearance, she had also tried to catch a taxi in the middle of the night to head home after work. And once again, the driver turned out to be strange. He didn't even take her all the way to her home, and during the ride began talking to her in a way that made her uneasy. She became suspicious of his behavior and asked him to stop the car. He refused. So when the car slowed at a traffic light on Place de la Concorde, she jumped out of the vehicle and ran away. The details provided by this woman were almost identical to the circumstances of Susanna's disappearance. It was nearly the same location where Susanna had gone missing. The time of night, and most importantly, the description both women gave: strange taxi. Hearing this testimony, the detectives had little doubt that she was referring to the same man they were searching for. They realized that there was a criminal operating in Paris, abducting women while posing as a taxi driver. They needed to find him, and fast, as panic was starting to spread in the city. People were scared, women tried to travel in groups, and parents were warning their daughters never to get into a taxi alone. Meanwhile, the investigators contacted an officer from the police department who was responsible for combating illegal taxis. They sent him the photo taken at the ATM and informed him that this person might have been picking up clients near the La Scala nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. As soon as the officer saw the photo, he immediately recognized the man. "It's Bruno Cholet," he said confidently. The man had been known to the police for a long time. He was 51 years old, and he had spent half of his life in prison. He started with petty thefts, then moved on to robberies. And at the age of 19, in 1978, he committed his first assault. 5 years later, he was released from prison, but he had not reformed. In January 1983, he picked up a 21-year-old woman who was hitchhiking. Taking a detour, he drove her into the forest. There, threatening her with a weapon, he forced her to undress and give him pleasure. He demanded that she help herself with her hand, and then forced her to lie on her stomach, and having completely undressed, he abused the victim, holding the barrel of a gun to her head and insulting her. After which, he took her scarf and tied her hands behind her back. The rapist left, leaving her completely naked in the forest. In December of the same year, he attacked a 12-year-old girl. After he had abused her, he drove her to the hospital because she had started bleeding. For 2 incidents of violence, he was given 16 years. He was released in 1999 at the age of 42. But what struck the police the most was his modus operandi, or method of operation, meaning the specific way in which a crime is committed by a particular individual. Each time, the attack would begin with the girl getting into the rapist's car alone, hoping he would give her a ride. Instead, he would drive them into the depths of the forest, threatening them with a weapon, tying their hands behind their backs, and taking what he wanted from them. Finally, the most interesting part, Bruno drives a white Ford Galaxy. The Ford Galaxy closely resembles the car that witnesses saw in front of the La Scala Club and at the location where the body was discovered. After studying Bruno Sciala's phone, investigators discovered that on the night of Sana's murder, it had been turned off. The man turned it on around 9 o'clock in the morning near the hotel where he was staying. After obtaining surveillance footage from the hotel's underground parking lot and lobby, they saw that Bruno arrived in his Ford Galaxy, wearing exactly the same clothes as the man who had withdrawn money from Sana's cards. At that moment, Bruno Sciala truly became the prime suspect. He was placed under round-the-clock surveillance. Firstly, because as a repeat offender, he could attack someone else. And secondly, because it was necessary to gather evidence to charge him. On April 25, 2008, officers monitoring the suspect saw him enter a store and buy a shovel. He then drove to the Bois de Boulogne, the Boulogne forest. The man got out of the car and began wandering between the trees, as if searching for something. Finally, the officers saw him kneel by a tree and dig something up. A package. The man brought it to the car and placed it in the trunk. For some reason at that moment, the detectives had no doubt that the suspect had unearthed the murder weapon in the forest. Therefore, the decision was made to arrest him immediately, without giving him a chance to react. When he stopped at a red light, the officers surrounded him and pulled him out of the car. They expected him to resist, but he showed no reaction at all and calmly allowed himself to be arrested, as if everything had been planned. The man was taken to the station and his apartment was searched. The police found the same sweater that was seen on the man in the photo, but Bruno had just picked it up from the dry cleaners, and it was completely clean. The search of the man's car was more fruitful, because in the car they found a small shovel with dirt still clinging to it, latex gloves, and several pairs of handcuffs, like the ones that had been on Suzanne. There was also a gasoline can in the trunk, although Bruno drove a diesel-powered car. This immediately raised the question, why would he need a gasoline can? But the most important discovery was the package in the trunk, which the man had obviously dug up in the forest. Inside this package was another one with the inscription, Suzanne 377. The police never managed to determine the meaning of this mysterious number, and Bruno, of course, refused to explain its significance. But in any case, inside the second package was a small suitcase containing a pistol and a silencer. The caliber of the pistol matched the murder weapon used on Suzanne and was identical to the casings found at the crime scene. As the ballistic examination would soon confirm, this was indeed the gun from which 4 bullets were fired, hitting the girl's head. From the very first moments of the arrest, it became clear that Bruno Sciala would be difficult to deal with. He was as unyielding as a stone, completely indifferent and unshaken in front of the investigators conducting the interrogation. However, this was not surprising. He had spent half his life in prison. He was a man who knew investigators, knew how to answer questions, and most importantly, was not afraid. When it came to his actions on the night of the events, he explained that he had been working but did not stop near the nightclub on Rue de Rivoli. They showed him a photo of Sana, hoping that his conscience would stir and that he would react in some way. It was in vain. He answered every question, insisting that he was innocent, and the interrogation had to be stopped. Yes, the detectives didn't get a confession, but there was already a lot of evidence against Bruno. They had found the murder weapon in his possession. A genetic examination of the weapon revealed both Sana's and Bruno's DNA, and a confession from the man wasn't even necessary to be convinced of his guilt. Therefore, the investigating judge immediately brought charges against him for the kidnapping and murder of Sana. Interestingly, after Bruno's arrest, when his photo was shown in newspapers and news programs, 3 more women recognized him and contacted the police. Each of them shared their unpleasant experience with the strange taxi. One of the women was particularly frightened by him. She thought she wouldn't make it out of his car alive. In an act of quick thinking, she managed to pull out a few strands of hair and hide them in his minivan, in case forensic experts would examine it after the violence and possibly her death. Fortunately, she survived and nothing worse happened to her. The trial began on September 4th, 2012. The courtroom was packed as it was a fairly high-profile case. Of course, Sana's family was present at the trial. Many were pleasantly surprised by their behavior. They did not show aggression toward the defendant. They were not like those who come to court with banners and t-shirts with loud slogans. On the contrary, these people were devastated by the death of their daughter, but they did not harbor hatred toward the accused, which is a rare occurrence. The trial provided an opportunity to delve into Bruno Schell's childhood and understand what might have influenced his development into a criminal. He never knew his father, as the man left the family before the birth of his son. When Bruno was a child, his mother gave him up for adoption several times, but later she regretted her decision and had him returned to her. One of the foster families especially welcomed Bruno, and the boy genuinely liked it there. For the first time, someone showed him genuine care and kindness. As Bruno himself admitted, had he stayed with that family, he might have become a worthy member of society. However, social services once again returned him to his biological mother, and he painfully experienced the separation from his foster mother. At the age of 5 or 6, he was placed in an institution for troubled children, where he was strapped into a straitjacket and given medication. His first escape occurred at the age of 7. By the age of 12, he was living on his own and left to fend for himself. At 13, he began selling his body to men. He was 13 and a half years old, slightly drunk, when he was assaulted by 3 men. One of them said, "Isn't this little prostitute just beautiful?" They tormented and insulted the teenager. If this event truly took place, it could explain why Bruno was completely devoid of the ability to empathize with others. He was examined by several psychiatrists and psychologists. However, they all agreed on one point. Bruno Schell was not mentally ill. He was very dangerous, with a high risk of recidivism. His childhood undoubtedly influenced his development into a criminal. He harbored hatred toward women because they caused him much pain by refusing to love him, with his mother being the first to do so. All these facts might have softened the jury's stance toward the defendant had it not been for his own behavior. On the 3rd or 4th day of the trial, he suddenly wasn't present in the defendant's dock. They couldn't bring him in because, in prison, he had stripped off all of his clothes in protest. This was inappropriate and outrageous, considering the charges against him. They sent guards several times, trying to persuade him to dress and behave appropriately during the trial. In addition, Bruno concocted a conspiracy theory against him, claiming that the investigators had planted the gun. According to him, they wanted him to become an informant in a case about illegal substances. However, when he refused, they decided to take revenge by involving him in a murder case. This was an astonishing statement, though, of course, no one believed him. In doing so, he only turned the jury against him. In reality, Bruno was prepared to fight for his freedom. He knew that if he was found guilty, he would never leave prison. The defendant had thoroughly studied his own case, knew it by heart, and even gave his lawyers hints about details they hadn't noticed. For example, the police hadn't examined tire tracks at the crime scene, which was crucial to the case. Sana's mother took the stand during the trial. She spoke in French, which was not easy for her, so her statement was brief. However, it was incredibly moving. The woman shared with those present how her days had been since her daughter's death. She had stopped sleeping properly. She was prescribed sleeping pills, but she stopped taking them because her dreams were the only place where she could meet her daughter, Sana. The words of this fragile woman seemed to touch even Bruno. At least that's what his lawyer claimed. In her opinion, the man saw in her the loving mother he had dreamed of in his childhood. But even that wasn't enough to melt his cold heart. Looking directly into the eyes of Sana's mother, he said, "Madam, I did not kill your daughter. I didn't even meet her." After 10 days of trial, the court delivered its verdict. Bruno was sentenced to life imprisonment. He could be eligible for parole after 22 years. The man appealed the sentence, but the court upheld the verdict. Bruno died of cancer in 2021 at the age of 65. He smoked 60 cigarettes a day and ended his life the same way he had started, alone. The Zetterberg family founded a foundation named after Suzanne, which helps children from disadvantaged neighborhoods in Paris. This is truly incredible, as they are Swedish and have no direct connection to Paris. However, what happened to Bruno in his childhood may have contributed to the person he became and the reason he attacked Suzanne. This is why the Zetterberg family decided to help the children of Paris, to reduce the likelihood of a tragedy like this repeating itself. They explain that establishing the foundation is not just about charity, but also a way to distance themselves from their anger. Sanna's father mourns that his daughter was supposed to return home on May 17, 2008. And she did return, but in a coffin, because of Bruno Schalli. But if he were to hate the killer, he would allow him into his home and his life, and would be forced to think about him every day. He doesn't want that. The murderer and rapist had already taken too much from them. That's why Sanna's father refuses to feel hatred toward him. Listening to the girl's parents, it becomes clear who Suzanne took after. She was a 19-year-old woman, mature beyond her years, capable of taking responsibility for her actions, thinking clearly, and taking life seriously. Her family wants as many people as possible to remember Suzanne. Since she had a passion for poetry since childhood, after her death, her family published a collection of her poems and stories in both French and Swedish. In addition, the girl's parents and brother planted a beautiful cherry orchard near Montmartre, a place their daughter loves so much. The cherry trees bloom every spring in memory of the prematurely departed Suzanne Zetterberg.
One woman risked herself to escape the clutches of a predator. Driven by her desire to return home alive to her children, she had no idea that her assistance in capturing the kidnapper would uncover a much greater evil and save many other lives. Collaborating with the police, the girl managed to reveal the true nature not only of the rapist but also of a serial killer. However, the way her memories of the attack were obtained raised doubts about the truthfulness of her words. The prisoner measured the field with his steps, moving across the ground with his feet shackled in chains. Without taking his eyes off the tall yellow grass, he immersed himself in memories. So much water had flowed since the last time he was here. His dark auburn beard had turned completely gray. The usual clothing he was accustomed to, jeans, a shirt and a cap, had become a luxury. Now he was accompanied by police officers whom he had once diligently avoided. Breaking nearly 2 decades of silence, the prisoner had just taken responsibility for the disappearance of several young women in the 90s. And now he had agreed to lead the police to their bodies, buried in a field outside Houston, Texas. For years, families in Texas and Oklahoma had wondered what happened to their daughters, who vanished under ordinary circumstances. During a morning jog, at a car wash, returning home after a theater group party. For a long time, they had no answers to their questions. Then the man standing behind their agony, a 56-year-old Texas prisoner accused of violence and abduction but not murder, suddenly spoke up. Police were able to link the kidnapper to at least 7 victims, including 4 girls who did not survive their encounter with him. Together, these cases paint the portrait of a serial killer, disguised as a benevolent Samaritan targeting a specific type of young brunettes found on the streets. The unexpected confession helped uncover the secrets of what happened to some of them, but the most pressing question for the families remains: why? In May 1997, 19-year-old Sandra Sapor graduated from high school and worked as an exotic dancer. She was raising 2 children and preparing to become a mother for the 3rd time. People who knew Sandra described her as intelligent and determined. It was these qualities that would ultimately save her life and unlock Pandora's box of other horrifying crimes. On May 17, 1997, the police responded to a call from a terrified young woman. It was Sandra Sapor. She recounted the nightmare she had just experienced. She had been kidnapped, and in order to escape, she had thrown herself out of a moving car. After reporting the crime, she was taken to a local hospital. It was there that she spoke with the police. Despite suffering serious injuries, Sandra insisted on talking to the detectives to prevent the kidnapper from harming anyone else. However, the fall from the moving vehicle had affected her memory. Details that would have aided the investigation were lost in her subconscious. Nevertheless, Sandra's memory would become an important tool in solving the crime. Since the police initially had no leads to pursue a suspect, they decided to approach the investigation from a different angle and arranged for Sandra to undergo hypnosis. After the session, she recalled minute details of the crime. She not only identified the model and color of the kidnapper's car but also remembered his face. It was a major breakthrough in the case. Sandra's description corroborated the version that the police had already developed regarding the potential suspect. Several weeks after the hypnosis, Sandra was asked to identify the man who attacked her from a lineup of several men. She identified a man named William Lewis Rice. Rice had long been known to the police due to his behavior and criminal history. Rice grew up on a farm nearby in Yukon, Oklahoma. Despite a difficult childhood, he had a particularly close relationship with his mother, who was willing to do anything for her son. A young William dropped out of school in the 9th grade to work, specializing in horseshoeing. By the age of 19, Rice stood before a priest and vowed to spend his life with a shy girl named Judy Fleming, whom he met in Anadarko, a city located about an hour's drive from Oklahoma City. He said if I didn't date him, he would shoot himself, Judy recalls. Initially, she believed in the young husband's good intentions, but soon realized that he could be incredibly cruel. The marriage did not go well from the start. Even before their first anniversary, Judy left her husband because she says he cheated on her. However, they reconciled and soon started a family, having a boy and a girl. But in 1982, Judy filed for divorce again. This time, it was because her husband showed aggression towards her. He broke into my new house and beat me. He held a knife to my throat, pushed me to the floor, and threatened me with a sawed-off shotgun, recalls Judy. At some point, Rice decided to leave Judy alone. He married and divorced for the second time. Judy remembers that his second wife called her multiple times, begging her to take Rice back. However, Judy, remembering how he once hit her so hard that half of her face turned into a solid bruise, refused the offer. Perhaps it was due to the 2 divorces that Rice plunged into a pit of alienation and loneliness, and his hatred towards women grew to such proportions that he saw no other way but to embark on a barbaric path of violence. On a fateful spring day in 1986, the daughter of a sheriff's deputy stepped out of the University of Oklahoma building and headed to work as an aerobics instructor when her Mustang got stuck on the interstate highway, Interstate 35. The 19-year-old girl panicked. The rain poured down heavily. A tall fence separated her from the hotel and shopping center where she could seek help. Just as she was contemplating how to climb over it, a truck pulled up beside her. Behind the wheel sat 26-year-old William Rice, offering assistance. Relieved, the girl got into the car. But instead of driving her to a phone, Rice stopped the car, grabbed the student, and threw her onto a mattress in the sleeper cabin of the truck. "Why are you doing this to me?" she screamed. The man simply replied, "He's crazy." Rice tied the girl's hands behind her back with sticky tape, stuffed her into an orange sleeping bag, and continued driving. When he parked the truck next time, he forced the girl to satisfy his desires. Later, at the trial, she would recount, "He pulled up his pants, said he loved me, that he was alone, and that we would always live in Houston." The girl played along with Rice to gain his trust and convinced him to let her use the restroom. Instead, she hurried to a payphone and called her family. While awaiting trial for the abduction and assault of his first victim, Rice attacked a woman he followed from a bar. He was found guilty of 2 assaults and sentenced to 25 years in prison. However, in October 1996, an appellate court was forced to reduce his sentence to only 10 years due to inappropriate comments made by the prosecutors. With nowhere else to go, Rice returned to his mother in Anadarko, where many locals knew little about his past. He seemed very polite, according to Kathy Dobra, a family friend who drove Rice to town as a favor to his mother so he could obtain a new driver's license. Now she regrets how foolish she was, never even thinking to ask why he had been in prison because it didn't concern her or her family. Not until the summer her teenage daughter disappeared. The spring of 1997 was cool, preparing to give way to the hot summer. The FBI had not yet established a national DNA database. Most Americans did not yet own mobile phones. Rice, approaching his 40s at that time, had recently moved to Houston. He found work on a construction site and also earned money by shoeing horses. One ranch owner recalls sensing that something was off about the new worker. Butch Bloodworth witnessed Rice striking a horse with a thick stick because the animal refused to stand still. He also made strange compliments to young girls and tried to sell the ranch owner a stolen bulldozer. However, at that time, no one knew that Rice, as the ranch owner would later note, was scouting for horses to shoe, things to steal, and girls to kill in the area. All they knew was that young women were going missing in the town. The crime rate had increased in the area along Interstate 35 and Interstate 45, from Oklahoma to southeast Texas. This region coincided with where Rice lived and worked. He was suspected of crimes due to his criminal record, but there was never enough evidence to hold him accountable. In particular, on April 3, 1997, just a few months after Rice was released and exactly 11 years after his first known attack, young ballerina Laura Smither failed to return home for breakfast after her morning jog in the suburb of Houston, Friendswood, Texas. The body of the 12-year-old girl was later discovered near a pond in Pasadena, 12 miles away, naked and showing signs of strangulation. Her appearance resembled other victims of Rice, and the nature of the attack matched his modus operandi, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime. After Sandra Sapor identified Rice, the police were finally able to build a case against the man who, they suspected, had been terrorizing the two states for some time. They found new evidence, including witnesses, to build a case against him. Although investigators could directly link him only to Sandra's attack, they knew he was connected to a series of other gruesome crimes. He was arrested, and the trial began in April 1998. On the witness stand, Sandra recounted what happened on the day of her abduction. She had stopped at a Waffle House to grab a bite to eat. When she returned to her car, she noticed that her tire had been slashed. Not seeing anyone around, Sandra contemplated her next move. At that moment, a man approached her, claiming he had noticed the problem with her tire. He said he had tools in his car that could help, but she needed to assist him in retrieving them. Sandra followed the man to his car, where he grabbed a knife and threatened her, forcing her to sit in the passenger seat. Fearing for her life and the life of her unborn child, she complied. As he drove her further away from the Waffle House, the abductor again threatened her with the knife and demanded that Sandra undress. It was then that she realized that if she didn't escape right away, she would not make it back home. She flung open the car door from her side and threw herself onto the road. Despite sustaining injuries, she believes that this act ultimately saved her life, as if she hadn't escaped, her abductor would have become her killer. The details she provided about the assailant aligned perfectly with Rice. However, Sandra's testimony came under scrutiny because she recalled the attack only under hypnosis. The defense argued that Rice had been named a suspect in a nearby murder, and his name and photograph could have influenced the girl's memory. They claimed that relying on hypnosis, a method not recognized by the scientific community, especially in a kidnapping case, was unreliable. The defense put up a strong argument. However, after 5 hours of deliberation on Friday, May 8, 1998, the jury found William Rice guilty of aggravated kidnapping, and sentenced him to 60 years in prison. Rice managed to stay off the streets, allowing the community to breathe a sigh of relief. However, it would take several years before he would reveal the most hidden secrets he had kept throughout his life. Around the time he abducted Sandra, DNA testing practices had not yet gained widespread use. Other crimes from the 1990s that Rice could have been involved in remained unsolved. However, in the mid-2000s, As DNA testing became more popular, detectives revisited these cold cases and were able to find perpetrators for many of the crimes. One of such cases became a pivotal moment for William Rice, the moment when he decided it was time to break the silence. Tiffany Johnston, the 19-year-old daughter of Katie Dobra, a friend of the Rice family who had helped him obtain a driver's license, had recently gotten married. On July 26, 1997, she planned to celebrate 3 months since her wedding day but stopped at Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany, Oklahoma beforehand. Suddenly, a man approached her. Threatening her with a knife, he forced her into his van. Driving her away from the car wash, the man assaulted Tiffany, strangled her, and hid her body in tall grass near a lake. Tiffany's body was discovered the next day. At the time, a DNA sample was found and tested. However, the results were inconclusive, and the case remained unsolved until detectives reopened it in 2015. They were able to examine another DNA sample found on the victim's body, and it matched the DNA of the already convicted William Rice. When investigators wanted to talk to him, Rice and his attorney decided that to avoid the death penalty for Tiffany Johnston's case, he would plead guilty. But the surprise was that Rice agreed to cooperate with the police to close other cases in which he was involved. Perhaps his serious heart condition, which was discovered, played a role, or he wanted to gain something through this cooperation. He feels like a huge weight has been lifted off his chest, his attorney noted. However, serial killer expert Jack Levin was not convinced by such a sincere motive. He feels relieved not because he feels guilty about anything, but because he's proud of it, the expert says. Most serial killers are sadistic, viewing their crimes as their greatest accomplishments in life. They are masters of manipulation, using torture as a form of control and often evolving into killers out of necessity to leave no witnesses. Nevertheless, Rice led the police to an area in Houston known as the Texas Killing Fields. It earned its name due to the frequent occurrence of brutal crimes and the discovery of bodies. With Rice's help, the police found the remains of Kelly Cox and Jessica Kane. Kelly Cox was a psychology student at the University of North Texas in Denton. At the time of her murder in July 1997, 20-year-old Kelly was the mother of an 18-month-old daughter, who was cared for by her grandparents while her mother studied and worked. On July 15, 1997, as part of an outing for her criminology class, Kelly visited the Denton County Jail. Personal belongings were not allowed inside the jail, so Kelly hid her car key under the wheel, making sure it was secure. However, when she returned to her car later, the key didn't work. Kelly went to a gas station to call her boyfriend. He promised to come as soon as he could. When he arrived an hour later, he couldn't find her, and she was nowhere near her car. For years, Kelly's parents had hoped to find out where their daughter was and what had happened to her, continuing to care for their granddaughter all that time. When Rice confessed to Kelly's murder and led the police to her body, her parents and daughter finally got the answers they had been seeking. Jessica Kane, a 17-year-old high school student, whose remains were found near Kelly, was involved in theatrical productions. On the night of her disappearance in August 1997, she was returning home after a party with a close group of actors. Jessica's car was soon found abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 45. Her purse was still inside. Police believed that Jessica saw the yellow headlights of the abductor's vehicle and, thinking it was a police officer trying to stop her, pulled over. However, like Kelly's case, the investigation into Jessica's disappearance had made little progress. Her body could not be found, and the police had little to work with. Rice's confession became a breakthrough in the case. After the discovery of the bodies, Rice was charged with the murders of Laura, Tiffany, Kelly, and Jessica. On May 28, 2021, in Oklahoma, the 61-year-old Rice was found guilty of the abduction and murder of Tiffany Johnston. On June 2, he was sentenced to the death penalty. He will now be transported back to Texas, where he will face charges for the deaths of Laura, Kelly, and Jessica. For years, Rice preyed on young girls and women, leaving them with deep emotional scars. He repeatedly proved himself to be a danger to society, and yet he was allowed to roam free for 5 months, during which he heartlessly abducted innocent girls and stole their dreams, and sometimes their lives. If it weren't for Sandra Sapo, it's unknown how many families today would be mourning their children, sisters, and wives. Sandra's survival story is extraordinary, and her brave escape from the clutches of a serial killer undoubtedly saved the lives of many other girls. Her courage led to the unraveling of other brutal crimes, providing answers to families who had long wondered about the fate of their loved ones.